Berlin, December. The city lay under a blanket of snow, its streets hushed, its lights glowing faintly against the night. In a quiet apartment block near Neukölln, a silence much heavier than winter itself pressed against the walls. And then, one sound shattered it, a single gunshot, sharp and final, ricocheted through the air. Neighbors stirred, their curtains parting, just in time to hear the echoes fade. Someone screamed. Someone else dialed emergency services with trembling hands. Within minutes, sirens tore down the street, their red and blue lights staining the falling snow. When the police forced the apartment door open, what they found was chaos, stilled into silence. On the living room floor lay a young man, his shirt blooming with crimson, eyes glassy, body motionless. Standing above him, hands shaking, was his father, still holding the weapon, his knuckles white against the steel. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. He whispered something no one could quite hear. The officers shouted commands, storming the room, but he didn't resist. He simply let the gun slip from his fingers, as though the weight had suddenly become unbearable. He collapsed into a chair, staring at the lifeless body on the floor, as though seeing it for the first time. From the corridor, a neighbor cried out, "Wasn't that his son?" Another voice followed. Why would he? It was a question that would echo long after that night. The news would travel quickly. Headlines would scream the unthinkable. German father shoots son in Berlin apartment. Yet beneath those, words lay a story far darker, far more twisted than the world could have imagined. Because this was not a crime of random rage. It was a crime born from betrayal, from secrets festering inside a family, from the collapse of love into something unspeakable. The father's name was Hans Müller. The son, Jonas, had been just 22 years old, a promising student with a future ahead of him. To the neighbors, the family seemed ordinary, respectable, quiet. No one could have guessed what lay beneath that facade. But every facade has cracks. And inside the Müller home, silence had become poison. Relationships had warped, loyalties had shifted, and boundaries had been broken beyond repair. What happened on that December night was the eruption of a storm years in the making. As Hans sat in custody later that evening, his face hollow, his eyes distant, he spoke just 4 words to the detective leaning over him. They broke me, words that hinted at betrayal, words that hinted at shame, words that suggested the true story was not yet told. This was more than a shooting. It was the unraveling of a family. A story of a wife's secret, a daughter's rebellion, a son's loyalty, and a father's breaking point. And it begins not with the sound of a gunshot, but with the quiet, suffocating silence of a marriage already dying. The Müller family had always appeared ordinary from the outside. Their Berlin apartment, tucked between a bakery and a dentist's office, looked like any other, neatly kept, curtains drawn, flower pots on the windowsill. To neighbors, they were polite but distant, a family of 4 who nodded in hallways, exchanged brief greetings, and lived without incident. But inside, their story was very different. Hans Müller, the father, was a man of order. At 48, his life had been defined by rules, those imposed by his father, by his military service, by the factory floor where he had worked for nearly 3 decades. He valued discipline and control. To him, emotions were a distraction, something to be buried under work, routine, and silence. When he spoke, his words were clipped, as though each syllable was an expenditure. His wife Clara once adored him for his steadiness. When they married, she believed his seriousness meant reliability, safety. But as the years dragged on, what had seemed like strength began to feel like distance. His love had grown cold, expressed only in duty. Birthdays were forgotten, anniversaries neglected, and conversations replaced by silence or criticism. Clara, now 45, found herself living with a man who no longer looked at her the way he once had. Loneliness grew inside her like a shadow. She filled the emptiness with small routines: cleaning, reading, long walks through Berlin's bustling markets. Yet nothing touched the hollow ache. She longed for tenderness, for connection, for someone to see her as more than a caretaker and housewife. Her children had once filled that void. Jonas, their eldest, was her pride: studious, responsible, thoughtful. At 22, he was studying engineering at the university. He had inherited Hans's quiet demeanor, but softened it with a patience and empathy his father lacked. To Clara, he was proof that the family could still hold together, that something good had grown despite the cracks. But Leah was different. At 20, she carried fire in her veins. Rebellious, restless, she pushed against every boundary her father set. Where Jonas obeyed, Leah defied. She dyed her hair in streaks of color, brought home friends Hans disapproved of, and stayed out late in Berlin's clubs. To Hans, she was reckless. To Clara, she was misunderstood. And perhaps, secretly, Clara admired her daughter's defiance. Leah represented the freedom she had never allowed herself. Their arguments with Hans often became alliances. Mother and daughter united against his harshness. Over time, those alliances grew into something more complicated. A bond blurred by desperation and need. The tension in the household was palpable. Dinner conversations were reduced to silence, interrupted only by the clink of forks. Jonas would sit quietly, trying to keep the peace, while Leah provoked her father with sharp remarks, and Clara either defended her or withdrew into silence. Neighbors sometimes heard raised voices through the thin apartment walls. "You'll ruin yourself," Hans would thunder. "You don't understand me," Leah would scream back. And then, inevitably, the sound of a door slamming. Jonas pretended not to notice. He kept his head down, focusing on his studies, though inside he felt the growing fracture. He loved his sister, but he also feared her recklessness. He respected his father, but he resented his coldness. And he pitied his mother most of all, sensing her quiet despair without understanding its depths. One evening, as Clara folded laundry, in her bedroom she heard Hans muttering in the living room, pacing like a caged animal. "No respect, none at all," he grumbled. She closed her eyes, clutching a shirt to her chest. The sound of his footsteps filled her with dread, not because she feared violence, but because she feared the weight of his silence that always followed. Clara had once dreamed of more. As a young woman, she had wanted to travel, to paint, to live beyond the narrow confines of domestic life. But marriage had anchored her, and soon children had chained her dreams to the ground. Now, looking at Leah, she saw her younger self, wild, untamed, alive, and she clung to that reflection, perhaps too tightly. Leah, for her part, craved attention, and when her mother gave it in abundance, she leaned into it. Their late-night conversations grew intimate, whispered confessions of longing and resentment. What began as solidarity against Hans became something more dangerous. A relationship built on shared loneliness, emotional dependency, and blurred boundaries. Still, Hans remained blind to the truth. His suspicions, when they came, would focus on the wrong enemy. To him, Clara's distance meant another man. To him, Leah's rebellion was the influence of outsiders. He could not fathom the possibility that the fracture lay within his own family, that the betrayal was not external, but internal. Berlin itself seemed indifferent to the Müller family's slow unraveling. Outside, life thrived, cafes buzzing, students laughing, trains rushing beneath the city. Inside, their apartment grew, heavier by the day, each room filled with silence, secrets, and resentment. Jonas tried to anchor them. He often lingered in the kitchen, helping his mother cook, offering his sister advice, even attempting to draw his father into conversation. But his efforts were like patching a sinking ship with paper. The storm brewing beneath the surface was too strong. One night, Jonas caught a glimpse of something he could not quite explain. Passing by his mother's bedroom, he saw the door slightly ajar, heard whispered words between Clara and Leah, and felt the chill of something not right. He froze, heart pounding, before moving on quickly, convincing himself it was nothing. Yet a seed of suspicion took root in his mind, though he dared not name it. The Müller family was already fractured, but fractures, if ignored, do not heal. They widen, deepen, and eventually break open. By the winter of that year, the silence in the Müller home had grown unbearable. Every word spoken was weighted, every glance loaded with unspoken anger. The family still sat together at the table, still appeared ordinary to the outside world, but beneath the surface, their lives were spiraling toward disaster. The gunshot that shattered the December night did not come from nowhere. It was the echo of years of silence, loneliness, and secrets unspoken. And soon, those secrets would begin to surface. The silence in the Müller household did not stay quiet for long. Silence, after all, has its own voice. It presses on walls, lingers in the air, and fills the gaps between people until the tension becomes unbearable. And in the Müller home, that silence was now edged with suspicion. Hans began to notice the little things first. Clara locking the bedroom door when he came home early. Leah lowering her voice when he walked into the room. The sudden halt of laughter between them when his footsteps echoed in the hallway. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia. Years of factory work and endless repetition had made him rigid, sometimes even harsh, and he knew his family resented him for it. But as the days passed, his doubt hardened into something heavier. Clara, meanwhile, felt her own world tightening. Her bond with Leah had grown into a strange intimacy neither of them had anticipated. Nights stretched into hours of whispered confessions. Leah leaning on her mother for validation, Clara clinging to her daughter for comfort. They told themselves it was harmless, that they needed each other because Hans could not provide what they longed for. But behind closed doors, their closeness blurred into dangerous territory, leaving them both entangled in secrecy and shame. Leah oscillated between exhilaration and guilt. On one hand, she felt empowered, finally seen, finally loved, finally central in someone's world. On the other, she felt trapped by the very closeness she craved. Sometimes she pulled away, slamming doors and insisting on freedom. Other times, she clung to Clara with desperate need. Their relationship had become a pendulum, swinging between rebellion and dependence, intimacy and distance. Jonas noticed more than he admitted. Sitting at the kitchen table, studying late into the night, he caught fragments of conversations that didn't sound like mother and daughter. He saw the way Leah leaned into their mother's touch, how Clara's eyes lingered too long. It disturbed him, but he buried the thought. He told himself it was imagination, because to acknowledge it would mean admitting his family was unraveling in ways he could not comprehend. For Hans, the pressure mounted. One evening, he returned home unexpectedly early from work. As he opened the door, he heard hurried whispers in the bedroom, followed by the creak of bed springs and the sound of the lock clicking. He froze in the hallway, heart pounding. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He stood there for nearly a minute, listening to the muffled voices, until Clara emerged, her hair disheveled, her face flushed. She startled when she saw him, fumbling for an excuse. "You're home early," she said too quickly. Hans studied her face, his jaw tightening. "Who were you with?" Her eyes darted, then steadied. "Just Leah. We were talking." The words should have been ordinary, yet something in her tone, in the defensiveness that edged her voice, lodged itself in Hans's chest like a splinter. He said nothing more, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded, threatening to burst. That night, Hans could not sleep. He lay awake beside Clara, staring at the ceiling, his fists clenched, memories twisted in his mind. His father's stern lectures about honor, His years in the army, the way betrayal had always been painted as the worst sin. Now he felt that sin breathing in his own home, poisoning the air he breathed. Clara sensed his suspicion, yet she told herself he didn't know the truth. Still, the weight of secrecy gnawed at her. She began avoiding Hans altogether, pouring more of herself into Leia, convincing herself it was survival, not betrayal. She didn't see how her distance only confirmed his darkest fears. Leia, caught between rebellion and attachment, began to unravel. She snapped at Jonas more often, accusing him of being their father's favorite. She mocked Hans openly at dinner, pushing his patience until he slammed his fist against the table. Instead of pulling back, Clara defended her, her voice sharp, her loyalty clear. To Hans, it was betrayal upon betrayal. Wife and daughter united against him, Jonas watching silently, powerless to intervene. The apartment became a battlefield of silence and sudden explosions. A slammed door here, a shouted insult there. Neighbors heard arguments muffled through walls, voices rising, then falling into suffocating quiet. The facade of normalcy crumbled behind drawn curtains. Hans began drinking after work, something he had never done before. He would sit in the kitchen with a bottle of schnapps, staring at the wall, replaying every glance, every whisper, every lie. His mind twisted the fragments into a narrative that consumed him. If Clara was hiding something, it must be with another man. That, at least, was an explanation he could grasp. The truth, unimaginable to him, remained just out of reach, though its shadow grew longer each day. One evening, Jonas tried to confront him. "Dad," he said carefully, "maybe you should talk to Mum. Whatever you think is happening, maybe it's not what it looks like." Hans's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're talking about. I don't want this family to fall apart." Hans slammed his glass down on the table, liquid spilling across the wood. "It's already falling apart." His voice was low, bitter, final. Jonas said nothing more. Clara and Leia's secret grew harder to contain. Their stolen moments carried the thrill of defiance, but also the dread of exposure. Clara sometimes wept afterward, whispering, "What are we doing?" Leia would hush her, insisting it was their bond against a cruel world. But the guilt never left. It seeped into their voices, their movements, their very presence. Hans felt the distance like a knife. He became more watchful, more volatile, his temper quick to ignite. He interrogated Clara with sharp questions, scrutinized Leia's every move, even eyed Jonas with suspicion for being too quiet, too detached. The family lived on edge, waiting for the inevitable eruption. The fracture widened the night Hans overheard them clearly. He had been sitting in the hallway, drinking in silence, when their voices drifted through the thin wall. Not just laughter, not just whispered words. Something unmistakable. Something that shattered any remaining denial. He rose, to his feet, his face drained of color, his heart thundering. He pressed his hand against the wall as if steadying himself, his mind screaming, but his body frozen. In that moment, the truth crashed down on him. Not an affair with another man, but something far worse, something unspeakable. He didn't confront them that night. Instead, he withdrew, his silence heavier than any scream. He carried the knowledge like a storm cloud, dark and swelling, waiting for the lightning to strike. Jonas saw the change in him. His father's eyes no longer carried suspicion alone. They carried a rage barely contained. Clara sensed it too, though she mistook it for the old anger she had lived with for years. Leia, reckless as always, ignored it entirely. But storms do not stay hidden forever, and in the Müller household, the storm was already breaking. The night it all unraveled began quietly, almost deceptively so. Snow fell steadily over Berlin, muffling the city's usual clamour, and in the Müller apartment, only the faint hum of the radiator broke the silence. Hans sat in his armchair, a glass of schnapps untouched on the table beside him. staring at the clock. It was late, far later than Leia usually returned from her nights out, yet he knew she was already home. He had heard her footsteps earlier, soft, deliberate, accompanied by Clara's. Then, the bedroom door had closed and silence had swallowed the apartment once again. Something inside Hans snapped. Weeks of suspicion, months of growing dread, years of cold distance, all of it fused into certainty. He rose, heavy and unsteady, and walked down the hallway. His hand hovered above the doorknob, trembling. For a moment, he considered turning back, but then he heard it. Muffled voices, a soft laugh, the sound of comfort shared in a way that no father should ever hear between his wife and daughter. His breath caught. His world collapsed. He shoved the door open. The sight before him burned itself into his mind. Clara and Leia froze, their intimacy undeniable in that instant. The closeness of their bodies, the guilt flashing in their eyes, the silence that followed more damning than words could ever be. Hans stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide, as though he had stumbled into a nightmare. "What is this?" His voice was low, ragged, shaking with rage and disbelief. Clara scrambled upright, her face flushed. "Hans, please! Don't you dare!" His voice thundered now, rising with years of repression exploding at once. "Don't you dare speak!" Leia, defiant as ever, pushed herself between them. "You don't get to judge us. You never cared. You never loved us. Her, me, anyone. You're nothing but a tyrant." Her words sliced through him, sharper than any blade. His hands trembled as he pointed a finger at her. You corrupted this family. You poisoned your own mother." Leia laughed bitterly, though her voice cracked. "No, you did. You crushed her spirit until there was nothing left. You made this happen." Clara burst into tears, her voice breaking. "Please, stop. Both of you stop." But neither stopped. Years of silence and anger erupted into a storm of accusations. Hans's face twisted with shame, rage, and humiliation. He had lost his wife to loneliness, his daughter to rebellion, his authority to scorn. And now, confronted with the undeniable truth, he felt stripped bare, mocked, broken, dishonored. Jonas appeared in the doorway, drawn by the shouting. His eyes widened at the scene. For a long moment, he couldn't move, couldn't speak. Then, he stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Enough! Please, this has gone too far. Stay out of this!" Hans barked, his voice cracking. Jonas shook his head, desperation in his eyes. "No, I won't. This isn't the way. You're angry, I understand, but violence won't fix this. You'll destroy us." Hans's chest heaved, his hands shaking. He felt the weight of every betrayal pressing down on him, every ounce of humiliation driving him toward an edge he could no longer pull back from. Clara reached for him, sobbing. "Hans, please don't." He shoved her hand away. His eyes darted to the cabinet where he kept the pistol, a relic from his army days. For years it had gathered dust, a forgotten symbol of discipline and control. Now it called to him like a final answer. Before anyone could stop him, he retrieved it. The room froze. Clara screamed. Leia's face blanched, her defiance cracking into fear. Jonas stepped forward, hands raised. "Father," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "This isn't the way. Put it down, please. Don't let this destroy you too." Hans's eyes locked on him, and for a brief second, something human flickered there. Pain, regret, the echo of love for the son who had always tried to hold the family together. But it was drowned by the tidal wave of rage. "You defend them," Hans spat. "After what they've done? After the shame they've brought into this home?" Jonas shook his head, his voice breaking. "I'm defending you, because once you cross this line, there's no going back." Leia moved closer to Jonas, her hand gripping his arm, her eyes on her father. "Do it then," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do it if you think it will fix the emptiness inside you. But it won't. It never will." Her words struck Hans like a blow. His vision blurred, His breath came ragged. His finger twitched against the trigger. Clara screamed again, lunging toward him. Jonas stepped forward at the same time, his arms outstretched as if to shield both mother and sister. Gun fired. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the small apartment. For a moment, there was silence, stunned, hollow silence. Then Clara's wail cut through the air, raw and broken. Jonas collapsed to the floor, blood staining his shirt, his eyes wide in shock. He gasped once, twice, and then his body went still. Hans stared at the weapon in his hand, his face drained of all colour. His son's body lay before him, lifeless, the one person who had tried to save them all. The room spun. The screams of Clara and the sobs of Leah filled the air, but he heard nothing. Only the echo of the shot, the irreversible finality of what he had done. He dropped the gun. It clattered against the floor, sounding far too small for the devastation it had caused. Hans stumbled backward, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on his son's still form. I didn't mean... His voice faltered, broken. He stood in the way, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. The apartment was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, soaked in grief and betrayal. The storm had erupted, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. And outside, beyond those walls, the first sirens began to wail, drawing closer. The door to the apartment finally gave way under the police's firm push. Red and blue lights flooded the hallway, reflecting off the icy snow that clung to the shoes of the officers. Inside, the room was still, almost impossibly still. Jonas lay on the floor, lifeless, a stark crimson stain spreading across the rug. Clara was kneeling beside him, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands pressed to her mouth. Leah stood frozen, her eyes wide, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. Hans sat on the edge of the couch, the pistol dropped from his trembling hands, its metal clattering against the hardwood floor. His chest heaved, his eyes vacant, staring at the destruction he had wrought. He didn't resist as the officers approached. He barely registered their commands, their urgent voices slicing through the thick fog of shock and despair surrounding him. One officer knelt beside Jonas, checking for any sign of life, while another gently guided Clara away from the scene. Her body shook with each step, her sobs echoing against the apartment walls. Leah's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, hiding her face in her hands, the reality of the night crashing over her like a tidal wave. Hans was placed in handcuffs, the cold metal biting into his skin, yet he barely flinched. He whispered, almost inaudibly, words that were meant only for himself. They broke me. Outside, the neighbors had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Some whispered, some cried, and some stood in stunned silence. No one spoke, but all eyes were fixed on the apartment, on the tragedy that had unfolded behind its walls. Even the snow seemed to fall more quietly, as if the city itself mourned. Detective Richter took the lead, speaking to Hans in a calm, measured tone. Detective, sir, we need you to come with us. You'll have the chance to explain everything, but right now, we need to secure the scene. Hans nodded slowly, his face pale, and allowed himself to be led from the room. His eyes, however, never left Jonas's body. The weight of the act he had committed pressed on him with unbearable intensity. Each step toward the police car felt like carrying the weight of a mountain, and yet he could not stop. Clara and Leah were escorted to another room for questioning. Clara clutched a blanket around her shoulders, rocking back and forth, whispering Jonas's name over and over. Leah, still in shock, could not speak. Her rebellion, her anger, all of it had vanished, replaced by fear, guilt, and disbelief. The bond between mother and daughter was now tainted with tragedy, and both of them understood the irreversible nature of what had just happened. Neighbors were interviewed, but none had seen the build-up to this moment. None had imagined the tension simmering inside the apartment. Hans had always been a private man, his family even more so. From the outside, they had appeared ordinary, quiet, polite, almost unremarkable. But now, that facade had been stripped away, revealing the storm of betrayal, secrecy, and suppressed emotion that had been growing for years. For hours, the apartment was examined. Evidence was collected, statements were recorded, and the tragic sequence of events was pieced together. Every creak in the floorboards, every door left ajar, every whispered conversation became a clue, a testament to the emotional implosion of a family that could no longer contain its fractures. Later, Hans sat in a stark, dimly lit holding room. His hands were cuffed, his head bowed. Occasionally, he raised his gaze, staring at the walls as though expecting some kind of judgment to appear there. His mind replayed the events over and over. Clara and Leah in the hallway, Jonas's eyes pleading for reason, his own trembling, hand reaching for the gun. The image was burned into him, unyielding, relentless. Clara and Leah were brought in separately, questioned by detectives who approached their grief with careful professionalism. Clara's voice trembled as she recounted fragments of the evening, her words punctuated by sobs. Leah's responses were short, hesitant, full of the confusion and fear of a daughter who had survived yet been emotionally shattered by the same hands that were supposed to protect her. As night deepened, the apartment emptied, leaving behind only silence and echoes of a family torn apart. What remained was not only the physical space but the emotional and moral wreckage. A father who had crossed a line from which there was no return, a mother and daughter who now bore the weight of secrecy and betrayal, and a son whose life had been extinguished in a moment of unimaginable anguish. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the streets in a soft white blanket, but inside, nothing could cover the scars left behind. Scars that would persist long after the investigation, long after the legal proceedings, long after the world had moved on. The aftermath was not only legal, but profoundly human. Grief, guilt, remorse, and the terrifying realization that some fractures could never be repaired. Hans was transported to the station, the cold night air biting at his skin. Clara and Leah would follow in separate vehicles, their silence heavy, their eyes hollow. In the hearts of all three, there was a mixture of fear, shame, and despair. And somewhere, beneath the rubble of their shattered lives, the question lingered. How had it come to this, and what would remain once the dust settled? The night ended, not with resolution, but with the beginning of reckoning. Each family member would face the consequences of their actions, their secrets, and their choices. Justice, of a sort, had arrived, but the true cost was far more profound than any law could account for. The Miller family's home, once a place of ordinary life, now stood as a silent witness to tragedy. Its walls, once filled with laughter and mundane routine, would now echo only the memory of a single night that changed everything. And as the city continued its quiet hum beyond the apartment, one truth remained clear. Nothing could undo what had been done, and no words could soothe the grief that had settled over the family like a shadow without end. The Müller apartment remained silent long after the police had departed. Its walls, once witnesses to laughter and ordinary family life, now carried the weight of tragedy, echoing every scream, every plea, every heartbeat that had ended too soon. In the emptiness, the truth lingered, harsh, unyielding, impossible to escape. Hans sat alone in a holding cell, the cold metal of the bench pressing against his back. His hands were cuffed, but the deeper restraints were invisible: guilt, shame, and the crushing knowledge of what he had done. The life of his son, Jonas, extinguished by a moment of rage, and the bond with his wife and daughter shattered beyond repair. He replayed the night over and over, trying to make sense of it, searching for a reason, a justification, anything that could bring relief. But the truth refused to bend. Clara and Leah, too, were trapped in their own prisons. Each whispered apology into the darkness of their separate spaces, knowing that no words could undo the secret they had kept. The forbidden intimacy that had set this chain of events in motion. Their lives were irrevocably altered. Fear, grief, and shame, now inseparable from the memories of what had been. It was a stark reminder that human choices carry consequences beyond immediate perception. The threads of betrayal, secrecy, and desire, once small and seemingly inconsequential, had intertwined into a web from which none could escape. One impulsive act, one hidden truth, had become the catalyst for unimaginable loss. Justice, in its legal form, would follow its course. Hans would face the consequences of his actions, and the law would weigh guilt and intent against society's moral standards. But even when a verdict was reached, even when sentences were handed down, the deeper toll, the emotional, psychological, and relational devastation, could not be measured in months or years. It lingered in the hollow stares of those who survived, in the quiet of an apartment now too heavy with absence, in the memory of a boy whose life ended far too soon. The story of the Miller family is a grim mirror of human frailty. It speaks to the dangers of suppressed anger, the corrosive effect of secrets, and the fragile nature of trust. It is a reminder that vulnerability can be exploited, that love can be distorted, and that the boundaries of morality are tested in the quiet, moments we think no one is watching. As Berlin moved on outside, life continuing in its indifferent rhythm, the apartment remained a monument to sorrow. The shadows of that night would linger, not only within the family, but as a cautionary tale for others, a warning that choices, even those born of fear, jealousy, or despair, have consequences that ripple far beyond the moment, far beyond the intentions of those involved. In the end, the tragedy of the Miller family is not simply the story of a father who could not control his rage. It is a story of human imperfection, of secrets that fester until they explode, and of the irreversible cost of actions taken in moments of passion and betrayal. It is a story that reminds us, once trust is broken, once the fragile fabric of family is torn, there is no undoing what has been done, only reflection, only memory, and the haunting weight of what could have been. The first light of dawn barely penetrated the grey skies of Berlin when the Müller apartment became a hive of activity. Police tape crisscrossed the entrance, a stark, unnatural barrier between the outside world and the devastation inside. Officers moved methodically, taking photographs, measuring distances, cataloguing every detail. Forensic teams crouched over, the bloodstains on the rug, careful to preserve evidence that might reveal the sequence of events. The room smelled faintly of gunpowder, alcohol, and despair, a combination that would linger in anyone who entered for months. Detective Richter, seasoned and unflinching, surveyed the scene with an experienced eye. He noted the position of the body, the location of the firearm, and the subtle disturbances in the furniture that suggested struggle. Nothing was left to chance. Every clue mattered. Every angle had to be examined. Hans had been taken to the station hours earlier. The ride was silent, except for the occasional hum of the siren and the crunch of snow under the tires. In the back of the car, he sat with his hands cuffed, staring into nothingness. Time had no meaning anymore. Each moment was a loop of regret and shock. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him in waves, and yet he felt strangely detached, as if observing someone else's life unravel. At the police station, Hans was placed in a stark interrogation room. The walls were grey, the fluorescent light harsh. Detective Richter entered with a notebook in hand, followed by a second officer to record the session. Hans's eyes followed them, unseeing, numb. Detective Richter. Mr. Müller, we need a clear account of the events last night. Step by step. Hans swallowed hard. His throat was dry. His voice trembled, barely audible. I came home. I found them together. Leah and my wife. I didn't mean to. He trailed off, his hands clenching in his lap. Richter leaned in slightly, carefully, without aggression. Detective Richter, you fired the gun, sir. Your son Jonas was in the room. What happened? Then? Hans's eyes filled with tears, and a shudder ran through his body. I couldn't stop myself. I thought he would. He tried to stop me. He was in the way. I never meant to. The confession hung in, the air raw and incomprehensible. Richter noted it, careful not to react. This was evidence, but it was also human tragedy laid bare. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, Clara and Leah sat in separate rooms, each struggling with their own torment. Clara clutched a blanket to her chest, rocking slightly as the events replayed in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about Jonas, his calm voice, his pleading, his sudden absence. Guilt coiled around her chest like a vice. If she had spoken sooner, acted differently, maybe none of this would have happened. But the thought offered no solace, only pain. Leah stared blankly at the wall, the reality of her rebellion and betrayal crashing over her. She had defied her father, hidden the affair, and in doing so, had set a chain reaction that ended in death. Her defiance had been a shield for her own shame, but it had failed. And now, she was left with the horror of her own role, a witness to her family's destruction. Outside, neighbors whispered to each other in quiet horror. The Muller family had always seemed ordinary, quiet, reserved. Few could have guessed the tensions simmering beneath the surface, the secrets that had grown like poisonous vines, ultimately suffocating the family from within. The investigation continued through the day. Detectives and forensic specialists retraced the movements of each family member. Fingerprints were taken, ballistic reports analyzed, and witness statements collected. Every small detail mattered: the angle of the shot, the distance between father and son, the position of the mother and daughter. The tragedy was not just personal. It was also a puzzle that demanded exact answers. At the station, Hans was questioned repeatedly. Each session stripped away layers of denial, leaving him exposed to the weight of his actions. He was tired, hollow, and haunted by the memory of Jonas's eyes, wide and pleading. Sleep eluded him, replaced by relentless recollection. Even the simplest movements, the touch of a door, the sound of a gun, the whisper of voices, triggered flashes of that night. Clara was allowed to see a counselor for the first time. She spoke in fits and starts, tears falling uncontrollably. Clara. I didn't know. I didn't see it coming. Jonas. He didn't deserve this. I should have stopped it. The counselor's voice was gentle, guiding. But even so, the words could not erase the guilt. Trauma was not something to be soothed by conversation alone. It was something that would live in her body, in her mind, in the empty spaces where laughter and love had once been. Leah, similarly, sat in silence for hours. Her thoughts circled endlessly around the moment she had been discovered, the confrontation, and her father's uncontrollable rage. Anger, fear, and shame twisted together, leaving her numb yet hyper-aware, haunted by the knowledge that every secret had consequences, and some consequences were permanent. The investigation also drew in extended family, friends, and neighbors. Statements were gathered from those who had noticed subtle signs, odd arguments, strange silences, unexplained tensions. Everyone's account, no matter how small, painted a fuller picture of a family fractured long before the tragic night. The truth was messy, painful, human. By evening, Hans was alone again in his cell. The city outside moved on, indifferent, unaware of the devastation that had occurred within one small apartment. He closed his eyes, trying to summon remorse, shame, grief, anything tangible. And yet, the emotions were chaotic, swirling in uncontainable waves. He was a man broken by his own hands, a father who had crossed an unthinkable line. Clara and Leah, meanwhile, returned to the empty apartment for the first time. Every corner reminded them of the life they had lost, every shadow of the night etched into memory. They moved mechanically, almost ritualistically, arranging the room, cleaning up, attempting to restore some semblance of order, but order was gone. What remained was the knowledge that their family, as it had been, no longer existed. The night closed slowly, with the city lights dimming under a grey, indifferent sky. The Müller family faced the aftermath of horror, guilt, and grief, a web of consequences that could not be undone. Justice would be served through law, perhaps, but the human cost was far beyond what any sentence could measure, and as the apartment settled into silence, the family members each stared into their own private darkness, realizing that while the investigation might reveal the facts, it could never heal the hearts, the trust, or the lives shattered in a single, irreversible night.